Welcome to my channel. Today, we are embarking on a journey to the southern edge of the world to explore a land of sweeping paradoxes and unyielding beauty, Argentina. Stretching from the tropical waterfalls of Iguazu to the frozen, windswept monoliths of Patagonia, this vast nation possesses a history as dramatic and operatic as the tango born on its streets. In this six-part series, we will dive into a story forged in the clash of civilizations, fueled by the myth of unimaginable wealth, and defined by a relentless struggle for identity, freedom, and survival. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, and let's get started. Part 1. The Pristine Land and the Dawn of Conquest, Pre-Columbian to 1800. Long before the cartographers of Europe drew lines across the Americas, there was a vast, untamed expanse at the southern edge of the world. This was a land defined by extremes, from the frozen monoliths of Patagonia to the lush, infinite sea of grass known as the Pampas. For millennia, this diverse geography was home to indigenous peoples. In the northwest, the Diaguita built fortified stone cities, deeply influenced by the expanding Inca Empire. In the south, the nomadic Tehuelche and Mapuche roamed the plains, living in harmony with the fierce elements. They called this land home, unaware that an ocean away, a hunger for silver and empire was turning its eyes toward their shores. The European intrusion began with a whisper of greed. In 1516, Spanish navigator Juan Diaz de Solis sailed into a massive, muddy estuary. He called it Mar Dulce, the Sweet Sea. Solis would not survive his encounter with the local Charrua people, but his expedition sparked a myth. Rumors spread of a mountain of silver hidden deep within the interior. Convinced that this muddy river was the gateway to unimaginable wealth, the Spanish named it El Río de la Plata, the River of Silver. The land itself would eventually take its name from the Latin word for silver, argentum, Argentina. Yet the myth was a cruel illusion. There was no silver here. Instead, the Spanish found an unforgiving wilderness. In 1536, Pedro de Mendoza established the first settlement of Buenos Aires. It was a disaster. Besieged by hostile tribes and starving to death, the colonists resorted to cannibalism before abandoning the site. The Spanish retreated inland, establishing Asunción in modern-day Paraguay. It wasn't until 1580 that Juan de Garay permanently refounded Buenos Aires. For nearly 2 centuries, Buenos Aires remained a backwater, neglected by the Spanish crown, which prioritized the gold-rich regions of Peru and Mexico. Rigid colonial trade laws forced Buenos Aires to send all goods across the Andes to Peru before they could be shipped to Spain. This absurd bureaucracy gave birth to a thriving culture of smuggling. Portuguese, British, and Dutch merchants traded illegally with the locals. A unique, defiant identity was taking root in the port city. Recognizing the strategic threat of British and Portuguese expansion, King Charles III of Spain finally acted. In 1776, he created the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, making Buenos Aires its capital. Overnight, the sleepy port transformed into a bustling administrative and commercial hub. The influx of wealth and new ideas from the European Enlightenment began to change the social fabric. A new class of American-born Spaniards, the criollos, began to question why they were ruled by a distant king. The seeds of revolution were planted in the fertile soil of the Pampas, waiting for the spark that would set the continent ablaze. Part 2. The Fire of Revolution and Civil Strife, 1806 to 1852. The spark arrived not from Spain, but from Great Britain. In 1806 and 1807, British forces invaded Buenos Aires, seeking to seize Spanish colonies during the Napoleonic Wars. The Spanish viceroy panicked and fled, leaving the city defenseless. It was the local Criollo militias who rose up, fought the British in the streets, and forced them to surrender. This historic victory delivered a profound realization to the people of Buenos Aires. They did not need the Spanish crown to protect them. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 and imprisoned the king, the legitimacy of colonial rule collapsed entirely. On May 25, 1810, during a week of intense political maneuvering known as the May Revolution, Buenos Aires formed its first independent government junta. The ties to Madrid were severed, but independence brought immediate division. While Buenos Aires wanted to dominate the new nation, the interior provinces fiercely resisted central control. The war for independence was fought on multiple fronts. In the north, Manuel Belgrano, a brilliant lawyer turned general, created the blue and white flag and defended the frontier against royalist forces. But it was José de San Martín, a military genius, who realized that Argentina could never be safe until Spain was driven from its stronghold in Peru. In 1817, San Martín pulled off one of the greatest military feats in history. He led the Army of the Andes across the treacherous, freezing mountain passes to liberate Chile before launching a naval assault on Peru. While San Martín fought for continental freedom, Argentina declared its formal independence on July 9, 1816, at the Congress of Tucumán. Yet as the foreign enemy retreated, the nation fractured into a bloody civil war. Two factions emerged: the Unitarios, who wanted a centralized government based in Buenos Aires, and the Federales, who demanded provincial autonomy. Out of this chaos rose Juan Manuel de Rosas, a wealthy Federalist cattle rancher who seized power as the governor of Buenos Aires in 1829. For 2 decades, Rosas ruled Argentina with an iron fist. He established a brutal secret police force, the Mazorca, which terrorized and executed political dissidents. To the gauchos, the legendary cowboys of the plains, and the poor, Rosas was a populist hero, a defender of Argentine tradition against Europeanized elites. To his enemies, he was a bloody tyrant. His rule finally collapsed in 1852 at the Battle of Caseros, defeated by a coalition of provincial rivals and foreign allies. Rosas fled to exile in England, leaving behind a scarred, deeply divided country that desperately needed a constitution.
Part 3. The Golden Age and the Radical Awakening, 1853 to 1930. With the fall of Rosas, Argentina entered a period of profound transformation. In 1853, a constitution was adopted, establishing a federal republic. Under a succession of visionary presidents, including Bartolomé Mitre and Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, the state focused on 2 core objectives: education and economic modernization. The vast interior plains, long held by indigenous tribes, were violently conquered during the controversial conquest of the desert in the late 1870s. This campaign expanded Argentina's agricultural territory exponentially, but resulted in the devastation and displacement of thousands of indigenous people. The stage was set for an economic boom of unprecedented proportions. By the late 19th century, Argentina had become the granary of the world. The invention of refrigerated shipping allowed Argentine beef and grain to feed the rapidly industrializing nations of Europe, particularly Great Britain. British capital poured into the country, funding thousands of miles of railways, modern ports, and grand architecture. Buenos Aires modeled itself after Paris, building wide avenues, opulent opera houses, and palatial residences. To be as rich as an Argentine became a common phrase in Europe. This immense wealth required labor. Between 1880 and 1914, over 4 million European immigrants, primarily from Italy and Spain, flooded into Argentina, forever reshaping its culture, language, and cuisine. But beneath the glittering facade of the Belle Époque, tension was simmering. The country was ruled by an exclusive oligarchy known as the Generation of 80, which maintained power through systematic electoral fraud. The millions of new immigrants and working-class citizens had no voice. In the tenement housing of Buenos Aires, a new cultural expression was born out of frustration, nostalgia, and longing: the tango. Concurrently, a political movement was rising. The Radical Civic Union, UCR, led by Hipólito Yrigoyen, demanded free elections and an end to corruption. The pressure became unbearable for the ruling class. In 1912, the Sáenz-Peña Law was passed, establishing universal, secret, and mandatory suffrage for men. In 1916, Hipólito Yrigoyen was elected president in the first truly democratic election in Argentine history. The working and middle classes had finally broken into the halls of power. Yrigoyen championed social reforms, but his administration faced economic instability following World War I, leading to violent labor strikes like the Semana Trágica, or Tragic Week, of 1919. The global Great Depression of 1929 dealt a fatal blow to the export-driven economy. In September 1930, the military stepped in, overthrowing Yrigoyen. Democracy was crushed, and Argentina entered what historians call the infamous decade.
Part 4. The Rise of Peronism and the Populist Era, 1930 to 1955. The military coup of 1930 ushered in a dark era of rigged elections, corruption, and conservative rule. As World War II raged in Europe, Argentina remained strictly neutral, but internal tectonic shifts were underway. Rapid industrialization forced rural workers to migrate to Buenos Aires en masse, creating a vast, unorganized urban working class. In 1943, another military coup overthrew the government. Among the leaders was a charismatic young colonel named Juan Domingo Peron, who took charge of the obscure Department of Labor. Peron did something no Argentine politician had done before. He listened to the workers, unionized them, and granted them real rights. Alarmed by his skyrocketing popularity, conservative military factions arrested Peron in October 1945. They severely underestimated his base. On October 17, 1945, hundreds of thousands of working-class Argentines, disparagingly called descamisados, or the shirtless ones, flooded into the Plaza de Mayo. They occupied the heart of the capital, demanding Perón's release. The military relented. Perón stepped onto the balcony of the Casa Rosada presidential palace to a thunderous ovation. A few months later, he was elected president. This was the birth of Peronism, a powerful populist movement that would dominate Argentine politics for the next 80 years. By Perón's side was his second wife, María Eva Duarte de Perón, universally known as Evita. A former radio actress from an impoverished background, Evita became the spiritual heart of the movement. She ran the Eva Perón Foundation, distributing aid to the poor, building schools, and championing women's suffrage, which was achieved in 1947. To the wealthy elite, she was an ambitious demagogue. To the working class, she was a living saint. Her political power grew to rival her husband's. But tragedy struck at the height of her influence. In 1952, Evita died of cancer at the age of 33. The nation plunged into unprecedented mourning. Millions lined the streets just to catch a glimpse of her coffin. Without Evita, and with the post-war economic boom fading, Peron's regime grew increasingly authoritarian. He censored the press, jailed opponents, and alienated the Catholic Church. The social polarization reached a boiling point. In June 1955, the Argentine Navy, in a desperate attempt to assassinate Peron, bombed the Plaza de Mayo, killing over 300 civilians. It was a terrifying preview of the violence to come. 3 months later, a military coup called the Revolución Libertadora overthrew Peron. The dictator was forced into exile, and the military banned even the mention of his name. But Peronism did not die. It went underground, waiting for the right moment.
Part 5. The Descent into Darkness and the Dirty War, 1955 to 1983. For nearly 2 decades after Perón's ouster, Argentina was caught in a toxic cycle of weak civilian governments and military interventions. The military tried desperately to cleanse the country of Peronism, but the working-class resistance remained fierce. By the late 1960s, inspired by the Cuban Revolution, the political landscape fractured into radical violence. Left-wing urban guerrilla groups, most notably the Montoneros, launched a campaign of kidnappings, bombings, and assassinations. In a desperate bid to restore order, the military allowed Perón to return from exile in 1973. He was triumphantly re-elected president, but he was old and ailing. When he died in 1974, his vice president and third wife, Isabel Perón, inherited a nation spiraling out of control. With inflation soaring and political violence escalating daily, the military intervened once again. On March 24, 1976, a junta led by General Jorge Rafael Videla seized power. They promised to restore order and Western Christian values. Instead, they unleashed a systematic campaign of state-sponsored terror known as the Dirty War. The junta viewed any form of dissent, from guerrilla fighters to union leaders, journalists, and student activists, as a subversive threat that had to be eradicated. Secret detention centers were established across the country, where thousands were systematically tortured. To avoid international backlash, the military adopted a horrifying tactic: secret executions. Victims were drugged, stripped, and thrown from military planes into the Atlantic Ocean. They became known as Los Desaparecidos, the disappeared. An estimated 30,000 people vanished without a trace. In the face of this absolute terror, a group of courageous women broke the silence. Las Madres de Plaza de Mayo, the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, began marching every Thursday in front of the presidential palace, wearing white headscarves and carrying photographs of their missing children. They demanded answers, becoming the moral conscience of a terrified nation. By 1982, the junta's economic policies were collapsing, and public anger was reaching a boiling point. In a desperate gamble to unite the country and divert attention from their atrocities, the military dictator General Leopoldo Galtieri launched an invasion of the British-controlled Falkland Islands, known to Argentinians as Las Malvinas. A wave of fierce nationalism swept the country. But the gamble failed spectacularly. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher dispatched a naval task force, and after a brief, bloody war, the poorly equipped teenage Argentine conscripts were forced to surrender. The humiliation was absolute. The military regime was broken, forced to step down and return Argentina to the hands of its people. Part 6. The Resilient Democracy and the Perpetual Crisis, 1983 to present. On December 10, 1983, democracy returned to Argentina. Raúl Alfonsín was inaugurated as president, inheriting a broken economy and a deeply traumatized society. Alfonsín took a historic step that defied the traditional impunity of Latin American militaries. He ordered the trial of the juntas.
For the first time, top military commanders were placed on trial in a civilian court for their human rights abuses. The horrific testimonies of survival shocked the world. The chief prosecutor, Julio César Stracera, closed his historic summation with two words that became the defining motto of the new Argentina: Nunca más, never again. While democracy proved resilient, the ghost of economic instability continued to haunt the nation. Hyperinflation forced Alfonsín to step down early, paving the way for the Peronist administration of Carlos Menem in the 1990s. Menem tied the Argentine peso directly to the US dollar in a policy known as convertibilidad and privatized state industries. This brought temporary stability and consumer wealth, but it masked structural weaknesses. In December 2001, the system collapsed completely. Argentina defaulted on its $100 billion foreign debt, triggering a catastrophic economic and social crisis. The banks froze all savings, riots erupted in the streets, and the country went through 5 presidents in just 2 weeks. Out of the ashes of 2001, a new political era emerged under Nestor Kirchner and later his wife, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. They championed a left-wing variation of Peronism known as Kirchnerismo, focusing on social welfare, nationalizing industries, and reopening human rights trials. Yet, the classic Argentine cycle of boom and bust persisted. Decades of heavy public spending, systemic corruption, and high inflation polarized society into a bitter political divide known as La Grieta, the rift. By 2023, exhausted by decades of stagnation and triple-digit inflation, the electorate took a radical turn, electing the eccentric libertarian outsider Javier Milei, who promised to dismantle the traditional political establishment. Today, Argentina remains a paradox. It is a nation blessed with immense natural wealth, world-class education, Nobel laureates, and a culture that has captivated the globe through literature, cinema, and unparalleled sporting triumph. Yet, its people live in a state of perpetual economic instability. The history of Argentina is not a simple story of progress. It is a grand operatic saga of passion, tragedy, resilience, and survival. It is the story of a people who have stared into the deepest abyss of dictatorship and financial ruin, only to rise again, unbreakable, fiercely proud, and forever marching toward the promise of their golden land.